Hello, everyone, wherever you are in the world. It's great to be connected on this first morning of CSW66. My name is Sandra Pepra, and I'm the Director for Gender, Women and Democracy at the National Democratic Institute. On behalf of Liberal International, the International Network of Liberal Women, and the National Democratic Institute, I welcome you to this panel, where a star array of political women from around the world will be addressing this year's central theme, gender, climate change, and we will also touch on the issues of conflict. Let me first say that this session will be recorded, so please take note of that. And when you are not participating fully, please make sure that your microphone is muted. Questions, which we hope there will be lots of them, can be fielded through the chat or through the Q&A function. And we've got wonderful people who are going to help us curate the question and answer session later on. But without further ado, let me introduce you to our opening speaker, Hakima el Haité, who is president of Liberal International and the United Nations Climate Champion. Hakima, thank you so very much for being with us this morning. We're ready for your opening.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to take part in this high-level panel and would like to thank our partners and speakers and moderator. Dear friends, we are living in a tragic moment in our history. A deadly pandemic, wars, the most recent of which is disastrous for the Ukrainian people and for the world. A growing climate crisis whose consequences are already devastating and will be even more so with irreversible effects according to the latest report of the IPCC. It is in this particular context that we address the topic of gender in the face of climate change and conflicts. Women, who represent 60 to 80% of the agricultural task force in the southern countries, face water scarcity on a daily basis. In Africa, for example, they spend 1.4 million hours a day fetching water. So much time to fetch firewood to cook and heat because of the lack of clean energy, with devastating repercussions on their health and that of their children. Together with children, they represent 75% of deaths during natural disasters. Today, the threats are greater and more serious, not only because the parties, members of the UN Convention for Climate Change have not advanced on their promises to reduce their CO2 emissions or to capacitate or to transfer the technology or to support financially the most vulnerable countries, but because of the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has wiped out decades of climate negotiations effort. Europe's dependence on Russian gas will undeniably disrupt the European Union's low carbon strategy and delays the deadline for the carbon neutrality of Russia's actions could lead to a major setback for reaching net zero carbon emissions, which is the key to controlling the changing climate. This war endangers also the food security of many countries of the South. Africa, for example, is importing 30% of its wheat from Ukraine, and the first who will be affected are, of course, women and children. It is therefore obvious that the consequences on women will be even more disastrous. But I remain convinced that the women victims are certainly part of the solution. Women, ranging from the doctor to the nurse, social help or maintenance worker, have exposed their lives and those of their family during the pandemic by putting themselves at the service of the peoples. Women in Africa ensure their families' water supply and food security while they know they are the first to be exposed to natural disasters. Ukrainian women left everything behind and went into the unknown to secure their children. And some of them placed their children with their relatives and returned to the country to take up guns. Afghan women have dared to face the danger of death because they can be executed by showing their faces as a sign of protection and demand for respect for human rights and women's rights. Finally, I would like to remind you and to remind the world that rare are women in the history of humanity who have taken a decision to start a war. Women have this ability to transcend their egos to maintain peace. And that is why Liberal International recently issued a statement for women to be involved in the mediation of conflicts. I hope that this war will convince the world's leaders that reliance on fossil fuel should be decreased as soon as possible, so that such events don't impact their economy and that of the vulnerables. If we had access to adequate renewable energy sources, the panic we are experiencing now would not have existed. Difference from the discussions comes the light. And I have no doubt that this exceptional panel will enlighten us on the different possible solutions that these women are not left behind in a tumultuous world. We can no longer deny the extreme danger that we are facing. It is time that we must move from talk to action. If not now, when? Liberal International is moving beyond just talk. The parties that make up our federation are taking the lead to ensure that women are involved in decisions that affect their lives. We must all pledge here today to do everything in our power to ensure that women are included at the table as decision makers, as climate negotiators, and as peacekeepers. The future of our world depends partly on it. So I wish you successful discussion and thank you for listening.
And thank you so much, Hakima el Haité, for your opening remarks. You're not only the president of Liberal International, but you're also the former Minister for Environment in Morocco. And we know that data shows, unfortunately, the slow progress of women in top jobs as minister in the environmental sectors. I think last year it was only 15% of the environment ministers across 193 countries that were led by women. But you have been one of the champions that pioneered and changed a lot. So thank you so much for introducing the lovely panel that we will just be starting.
Thank you, Brigitte.
Yes, thank you, Hakima. So good afternoon here from Stockholm, Sweden. It is a great honor for me to be moderating the panel arranged by Liberal International, National Democratic Institute, and International Network of Liberal Women. And my name is Brigitte Olsen. Since 2 years back, I'm the director of political parties at the NDI. And my own experience comes from political parties, well, actually from the Liberal family. So it feels a bit like coming home here today. During 12 years, I was a member of the Swedish Parliament, and I spent also 5 years as a minister of in the Swedish government for European affairs and democracy. And as Hakima mentioned, democracy is under siege right now. We have the 16th consecutive year of declining global freedom. We're in the midst of a perfect storm of populism, authoritarian leaders. And on top of that, we have the aggressive Russian war in the democracy of Ukraine. So today we're going to discuss a topic that ought to be on every single politician's agenda. The IPCC's most recent report makes clear that the window of opportunity is rapidly closing. Time is running short. We've seen the recent extreme weather events, such as the deadly floodings in many countries around the world. Last summer, with the widespread fires that even the richest countries can't control, is only a taste of what's to come. This is the make or break decade that we have ahead of us. And we know that inclusive representative democracies and political processes are key to resilience from these shocks, including the natural and man-made disasters which have increased due to climate change, and of course, lasting peace. Gender equality is a central element of climate justice. We know that women and girls, as Hakima mentioned, are the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change and environmental degradation. And the facts are indisputable. And women and children, they're more likely to die than men in the natural and man-made environmental disasters. And we know that when the resources are scarce due to drought or deforestation, women have been subjected to everything from sextortion in order to gain access to water or firewood. And we know that according to World Economic Forum, less than 20% of the land in the world is owned by women. But women and girls are also leading the fight. We know Greta Thunberg, Vanessa Nakate, Autumn Peltier, Isra Heshi, Ridhima Pandya, and many others. Women and girls of all ages all over the world, they are the change makers on the streets, in parliaments, in running businesses, in civil society, and in organizations. And some of these great women are here with me today. So it's a great pleasure for me, a privilege to introduce our panelists. We have Gloria Hutt, the former Minister of Transportation and Telecommunications from Chile. We have Yayanti Devi Balagru, the President of International Network of Liberal Women and Chairperson of the Women's Caucus of Council of Asian Liberal Democrats. We have Mpatso Jumbe, who is the founder and executive director of MOVE, the managing director and owner of the Mayfair Dairy Farm. We have Susanna Rivera Bogman, who is the Foreign Affairs and Cooperation Advisor, the Secretary for Climate Action Catalonia, and also the Deputy Chair of the Climate Justice Committee at Liberal International. And I would like to start off by asking our individual panelists on around 5 minutes to answer my question. And I would like to start off with Gloria, but you will have the same question, all of you. Cristiana Figueres, who was the former executive secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, she once said, "Climate change, above all, is a justice issue. It is a social issue. It's a gender issue." I would like all of you to reflect upon your own work on climate issues and maybe also share briefly your story on how you became a fighter for the climate. And should we start off with Gloria, please?
Yes, we have in our country very concerned about the two issues that we have heard today. First is women participation, and today we have a new government starting that has defined itself as a feminist government. So everything is focused on the message and the formal message and the institutional message of women taking place in the table of decisions. The Ministry for Women is now part of the political committee, which never happened before. So it's a very good message to bring women into the decision stream. In terms of climate change, we have been also quite active. We have a strategy, a transport strategy, and that's why I am here in part, because we defined that for by 2040, all the public transport in Chile will be electric. And I led a project to replace the bus fleet in the country. We have now about very few, less than 1,000 electric buses running. Transport stands by about 30% of CO2 emissions. So it's very important to tackle on transport. And we are moving very fast towards electric mobility in all levels, but focusing first on public transport. So I have been quite active in that sense, and the new government will also continue the effort to replace the use of fossil fuels in much faster than it was stated in the beginning. And as our former president said, we are the last generation that can do something concrete to save and to protect the next generations in terms of climate change. It also happens in Chile that women are more negatively affected by not just because of climate change. In every aspect, we are still behind men. So it's very important to put the issue in the agenda in all the sectors, not just climate change, which is very important, no doubt, but we need to be aware of the need in all other areas of our public activity.
Hey, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah. And let's go to Hakima and ask Hakima the same question about the connections when it comes to women and gender issues and climate issues, and also how you became a climate fighter, Hakima, that we all know that you are.
Yes, do you hear me? Yeah, I said that I used to be dealing with the first environmental office study in the MENA region, and I experienced it myself, the hard time women and children were living in Africa and in the Middle East, etc. So for 25 years, I developed water management strategy, development strategies, etc. But what is important to say is that we need to understand, as Gloria said, that the climate change and sustainable development and all the rights of women are the same, are the faces of the same coin. We cannot reach sustainable development. We cannot fight and eradicate poverty if, and you know that the most vulnerable and the poorest people of this world are women. We cannot eradicate poverty and reach the sustainable, the 2030 sustainable goal if we do not deal with climate change, because climate change is threatening food security, water supply, development. When you don't have water, you have nothing. When you don't have access to energy, you don't have anything. So I think that those are the two faces of the same coin, and we should link, and it's why within Liberal International we have created this Climate Justice Committee in 2018, because the links between climate change, human rights, and gender issues are very close and are interdependent. And the last thing to say is climate change should be transversal in all the policies of a country. In any policies we need to have build strategies which are resilient to climate and which are low carbon technology based. So this is the global transformation the Paris Agreement is talking about.
Okay, thank you so much, Hakima. And let's go to Yayanti. What is your take on this, the connections between climate justice and gender equality, and also your personal story, of course?
Thank you, Brigitte. And good afternoon to those watching us in Asia, and good morning to our viewers in Europe. When we look at the issues of gender, climate change, and conflict, it is imperative that we adopt an intersectional, gender, transformative human rights approach. This approach recognizes that there are multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, inequality, and power dynamics that affect people's rights. For one, social, cultural, economic, and political structures and systems all play a role in shaping the context where women live. As regards climate change and gender, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and the CEDAW's General Recommendation number 37 recognizes the gender-related dimension on the disaster risk reduction in the context of climate change. There is also the UNFCCC Gender Action Plan, which was adopted at COP23 in 2017, requiring member states to adopt gender-responsive policies. Sad silenced issue. Nobody actually want to talk about it, or we have enough representation or enough information to include this into the national policies. So we are actually very, very far behind and lagging on these issues. While these recommendations and agreements are important in terms of setting the overreaching framework, it must be said that much more needs to be done on the ground, especially in Malaysia. In Malaysia, for example, policymakers seem to lack the vision to integrate gender mainstreaming policies into the governance. Hence, the country, like I said earlier, is lagging behind in terms of involving women in climate crisis issues and discussions. Part of the reason for this is that women remain to be underrepresented in leadership positions, with less than 18% women in the parliament. This clearly indicates how women's voices are not heard, which in turn results in their rights not being recognized. Moreover, as we are all aware from the global statistics, and as Hakima rightfully said earlier, women account for the majority of the world's poor. Hence, it should not come as a surprise why they are more disproportionately affected when there are climate-related disasters, which, it must be said, hit the poor the hardest. Women are also facing more social, economic, and political challenges than men in order to recover from climate-related disasters. In many rural parts of Malaysia, there are numerous communities that rely on natural resources for their everyday living, especially in agriculture and farming. This includes the indigenous groups and communities, particularly in Sabah and Sarawak as well. These communities who rely on agriculture and farming are affected by the lack of natural resources during droughts and other impacts of changing weather patterns. This in turn affects their ability to earn a consistent income. In these instances, the burden is passed on to the women, who have to look for alternative sources of income to make both ends meet. This in turn makes them more prone to discrimination and exploitation, resulting in a vicious cycle that affects women's livelihood and security. The climate crisis affects men and women differently because the social, cultural, economic, and political structures are biased against women. These multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, inequality, and power dynamics must be viewed in their entirety using the intersection of transformative human rights approach so that holistic and effective responses can be forged. Much more needs to be done to address climate crisis impact and its disproportionate effects on women across the world. And much more needs to be done to recognize, accept, and include women who can be the agents of positive changes in many societal issues, from climate change to conflict. Using the intersectional, gender transformative, and human rights approach can be an important first step in our continuing efforts to build a more inclusive, peaceful, and sustainable world. And that's exactly how, as an advocate and a solicitor in Malaysia, and as an activist, we keep pushing, hoping that in small baby steps, we can reach where we need to reach. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jayanti. And let's go to Mpatso Jumbe. What would you say between the connections between social justice, climate change, and gender issues, and also, of course, connected to your very strong and personal history in this field? Mpatso, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brigitte. I would like first to agree that climate change above all is a justice issue. It is a social justice issue and it is a gender issue. When it comes to African women, African indigenous women, we cannot talk about climate justice without talking about land justice, because how we manage land is critical to climate justice, and it is also critical to conflict. So we can't talk about climate justice also without talking about land justice, without talking about racial justice, without talking about economic justice. So sometimes we look at climate justice as if it's something new, but we know that climate justice is as old as discrimination against women. We know that climate justice or land injustice is as old as human rights violations. Therefore, when we talk about the experience of women, like our previous speaker talked about African women bearing the brunt of using the land, basically. Most of us African women are in agriculture. I think that's a real privilege. Most of us women are farmers. Most of us women, indigenous women, we live close to the land. So for me, my story begins with the fact that I am a woman. As we put it in politics, what is personal is political. When we talk about politics and change, we are talking about our personal stories. We are talking about our personal experiences. When we talk about human rights and justice, we are talking about our everyday aspirations to live a good life as individual people. And I think that in relation to climate justice, then we can't run away from the fact that most African countries have colonial baggage. That is our history, but it still remains true today. Today, Africa is a very interesting new economic frontier. Africa is not poor. We know Africa is rich with minerals, but the question for us as feminist liberals, people who respect human rights, people who believe in human rights, because we understand that conflict or violence, like the war in Ukraine, peace does not come by the end of violence. Peace is determined in our everyday behavior, the type of policies we have, and the appreciation of the diversity that we have in the world, and that is critical. So for African indigenous women, I think we need to appreciate the type of diversity we have, the type of histories that we have as women when we come to the table, and our aspirations when we talk about climate justice. For me, as a climate justice activist, I see these issues every day. I see these issues about land, big agricultural companies coming into Africa and owning land, displacing people. But these issues are not part of the climate justice conversation, but they are real for African women. These are real everyday experiences that keep pushing women into poverty. And if these issues do not come to the table, we will have a global conversation that is talking about CO2 emissions, which is talking about reducing CO2 emissions. And then women who are having everyday experiences that never even make it to the table. So I would like to read a quote by Wangai Maathai. She says, in the course of history, there comes a time when humanity is called to wear a new level of consciousness, to reach a higher moral ground, a time when we have to shed our fear and give hope to each other. And that time is now. So when we talk about land justice and when we talk about conflict in the world, when we talk about crisis, I think the essential element for every single human being is peace. For us as liberal feminists, what we talk about our own experience with patriarchy is the experience that women in Africa also have with racial discrimination. Women in Africa have with colonial baggage, because we know that this is an issue even up to date. But what we strive for is the common ground that every single human being on earth must enjoy their human right. And therefore, in this panel, and for me, my own personal story is that I wake up every single day feeling that I must have that right to self-autonomy, that right to free conscious, that right to live in a peaceful country, and that right to have access to land, and have to call myself a full citizen of Africa, a full citizen of Malawi. And I think that's a greatest privilege, and that's where we begin the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mpatso, for this. For this. And also, last but not least, I want to give the floor to Susanna Rivera to just also explain about the connections between climate change and gender issues from her personal story. So please, Susanna.
Thank you, Brigitte. Good morning, good afternoon from Barcelona. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this discussion. Indeed, climate emergency stresses human and natural systems and aggravate pre-existing political, social, and economic conditions that provoke increase and renewed conflict. In fragile or unstable contexts, as our colleagues have already stated, climate impacts such as sea level rise, floods, droughts, and intensify natural disasters that trigger, for example, crop failures, food and livelihood insecurity, natural related conflicts, instability, forced displacement, exploitation and environmental degradation. All these can undermine peace and insecurity. It's a fact that fragility and climate threats amplify potential conflict risk, and in turn, conflict diminishes people's ability to cope with future climate shocks. As already stated, climate change and conflicts affects everyone, but not equally. It disproportionately affects countries in the global south, which also bear the least responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions. In rural areas of developing countries, women often relied on natural resources as a critical source of sustenance and income for themselves and their families. They're often responsible for collecting water, procuring and producing food, and sourcing fuel for heating and cooking. Their dependence on natural resources and climate change is intensifying the depletion of already stressed natural resources, renders them vulnerable to changes in the ability and quality of these resources. So despite being the key gatherers and suppliers of these resources, women's lack of equal rights of ownership and control over land, property, or even over the resources they produce. There are a lot of studies that shows that women are disproportionately affected by climate shocks, and also affected because their different income, assets, legal and customary rights, or gender roles and social cultural norms. This structural gender inequalities make women more vulnerable and add burdens for women. It puts them at a disadvantage in situations of conflict, crisis, and increases their vulnerability to climate impacts. Moreover, the impacts of climate change on women can be further exacerbated at the intersection with class, race, or ethnicity. And conflict can also disrupt access to essential services as justice systems, education, healthcare, especially for displaced women. Conflict and situation of instability exacerbate, as I said, pre-existing vulnerabilities and patterns of discrimination against women and girls. I believe we have to be more effective in addressing the root causes of vulnerability, and that, of course, the destruction of natural habitats that sustain life and livelihoods, but also water, air, soil pollution. This is all increasing the vulnerability and exacerbating inequalities. So it's fundamental to tackle the triple crisis, not only climate, but biodiversity and environmental pollution crisis in a more mutually and reinforced way. My experience as a practitioner in the field of sustainability is that I have dedicated my professional career to showcasing the benefits of improving environmental management, empowering companies and organizations to implement sustainable solutions on the ground, connecting subnational and global efforts, and translating political commitments into action. I have attended many climate talks and COPs, and I would like to underline some positive developments that we saw in COP26 in Glasgow. the international community starts to endorse science. The latest IPCC report is alarming. Climate shocks and other evidences are irrefutable. The international community also starts to see that climate adaptation is no longer an option, starts to realize that the urgent need for cooperative and multi-level and multi-stakeholder action. And there's a pressing need to an unprecedented acceleration and investment to build resilience. What we see is that this is not an agenda of the global south. It is also an increasingly matter of broader concern across all world regions. We are understanding that human development is not possible unless it's compatible with net zero emissions. So what's at stake from my perspective is the model of development of the global north and the south, and the sake of our future generations. So enhancing action and support, including finance, technology, and capacity building to address losses and damages associated with the adverse effects of climate change, is a matter of climate justice. So climate change is not just an environmental issue, but an issue of social and economic justice too. And I fully agree with Mrs. Figueras that climate is a social justice issue and a gender justice issue, because climate impacts are both localized and gendered.
Thank you so much, Susanna, and also happy to hear some positive news. And also, we need to be hopeful, otherwise we can never change. And I also wanted to give the floor back to Hakima, who will be leaving us in a few minutes, but also to add a few more comments. The floor is yours, Hakima.
I was very pleased to listen to Fadzo, and very inspired by her. And I met many women like her on the field, facing and tackling on a daily basis climate change. I would like to tell you that Africa has not only minerals, and I'm always saying that Africa is a rich country where are living poor people, because we have in Africa 500 million hectares of agricultural and arable lands which are not cultivated. We have 60% of gold, world gold reserve. We have the biggest reservoir of solar energy in the world. We have 40% of diamond. We have all what we need to make Africa a rich country where the population can live in dignity. Now, the problem, and you are right, Fadzo, and this is maybe our next fight. The problem, because I worked a lot with women in Africa, the problem is the access to land and access to finance. And I have proposed, together with Christiana Figueres, with the former champions of climate change, I have proposed to create a dedicated fund for women, because women are not only working in agriculture in Africa, they are working in fisheries, and they are losing their production during the transport because they cannot, they are not able to condition their production, because they are transporting in a very at low speed, and the production is lost. Many of the production is lost because they don't have the equipment and the right equipment to deal with the materials. So we have already built a project, and if you want, Fadzo, that maybe will be the opportunity, because you are based in Africa, we have the project, and all our friends around this table in this panel can support us to raise money and to support women on the land to deal with agriculture, and also to lobby and to advocate towards the government to give access to women, because in some countries in Africa, women have no right to have access to lands. So this is my proposal for you, and I would love to discuss together with you how we can make it happen on the ground.
Great.
And I will just continue with you, in fact. So thank you so much, Hakima, for initiatives. I think it's very important to use this conversation to kind of bridging the divide, but also meet, because and go to action. But in fact, so I wanted to continue with you, and you spoke very strongly about the power of women and how we can make it happen. But how do we bring the voices of the indigenous African women to policy making spaces? What would your advice be on that one? And also when it comes to how do we ensure there is no inequality within the women's spaces? And when it comes to inclusion of African female politicians and so on into this climate feminist discourse. I would like you to elaborate more on that one, because you have such a strong voice that we want to hear more of.
All right, thank you so much, Brigitte. I think in terms of bringing Indigenous women's voices onto policy-making platforms, one thing that I would want to request us to think of, one, is the fact that we are all aiming, again, going back to the essence of our humanity, we are all aiming to just live peacefully wherever we are. And I would like to suggest that maybe what is most critical is understanding and appreciating that diversity. As liberal feminist women, we talk about human rights, we talk about democracies, but we should also appreciate that that human right and that democracy might look different somewhere else. So in my context, for example, I have been absolutely blown away with the type of knowledge that women have in relation to the land, because most African women, we have the privilege of living on the land. We have the privilege of knowing what scientists know. So when we talk about science, for example, informing policies, I always laugh at how this rich knowledge that helps women and Indigenous people manage land never makes it into the mainstream. And why? Because it's not peer reviewed. So if it is not peer reviewed, then it will never be used in science. It will never be used as mainstream knowledge. And I think that we need to change the narrative. We need to change the narrative from saying we need to develop Africa. We need to change that narrative, because Africans never say we need to develop America. We need to develop Europe. We never say that. So then Africans must develop Africa. If we're going to have development partners who are going to come on board, we must understand that they're indigenous people who have lived in areas the same way that it is true for people living in the Netherlands, the same way the British people are. So are Africans. They have their own rich history, their own governance systems, and own ways of managing land and managing conflict. And I would like to just build on what the previous speaker had mentioned, for example, that as we're moving forward to dealing with climate justice, it is no longer about just a few countries that come on board, but it's about having multiple stakeholders. So for me, I want to go back to the quote, Wangari's quote. It is about the fear of the unknown, the fear of not knowing the other person, the fear of letting go and understanding that democracy and human rights will look different in different places. So for me, Indigenous knowledge is key. Indigenous knowledge is key to the development of Africa. Indigenous knowledge is key to climate justice, and also key to ensuring that we limit this type of conflicts that we're seeing everywhere. Because again, the conflict that we see across the globe, the war that we don't want to have, is simple. Is that people, wherever they are, have access to land, have access to basic necessities, and they know how to do it on their own. So if we are going to develop, or if we're going to have sustainable development globally, then we must respect the diversity that we have and the knowledge that people have uniquely in different places. Now, when it comes to engaging African women politicians, I think it's the same thing. When we come to the table as feminists, when we come to the CSW, I will tell you that in my circles, people don't even know about CSW. And I think that's a tragedy, because as UN member states, I think this should be a critical issue. We should really think about the status of women every year. How have we moved and which direction are we going? So when it comes to engagement, again, it's on the same issue. And I know that these issues are heavy. They're not going to change in one day. But I would like to make a call to those of us who are politicians today, those of us who are activists today as women today. Because when African women come to the table, they don't only deal with patriarchy, as I said. We also deal with race. We also deal with economic injustice. So then the burden of participation means that the gap between a white woman on the table and an African woman is quite huge. Now, bridging that gap for me, I think is essential to having more stakeholders coming on the table, to have sustainable development in our, in the globe. For us to make sure that we have peace, we also have to deal with these very uncomfortable things that most of us feel afraid to deal with. But again, as I'm finishing, I would like to go back to the essence of humanity. Each one of us, we live under the same sun. There's no actual physical boundary between any nation and the other, unless if we create it. We use the same air, we use the same water. We live within the same environment. We can respect where every nation has its own autonomy, and that must be respected. But we must also celebrate the diversity. We must deal with the things that have informed the type of conflict that we have had historically. And if we want to end that, I think that it is up to us as feminists to give meaning to our own feeling of discrimination when we deal with patriarchy, to understand that there are also women who are feeling the same way and excluded the same way patriarchy excludes women. We are excluded because of race, because of economic inequality. And again, my call as we're moving forward is that we need this diversity. We need everybody on board in order for us to have a sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mfatso. And I would like to go from the African context to the Latin American context and to Gloria. And I wanted to ask you, Gloria, right now when we're among liberals here, how a liberal approach can kind of make the difference when it comes to strengthening women's role in decision-making, and also, of course, connecting to how to fight climate change. And also specifically when it comes to the context of Latin America, if you would elaborate a bit more on the situation for women from that point of view, we would be happy to learn more from that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are you with? Oh, yes,
I'm okay. Yes. Well, being liberal means having freedom to choose. And to be free to choose, you must have equal opportunities. So there is a very basic concept in making the field equal for every citizen. In our opinion, that's the key element that we have to work for. If all the persons have the same opportunities to make their decisions, then we will be fully liberals. And that's one main concept that we focus our action in our political party, the element of justice, of freedom to choose, of equal opportunities is absolutely relevant. In Latin America, we still have a very high proportion of the population that is very poor, a low-income population. And within that population, many households have a woman as a household head. There is no man as a head in that household. So all this distortion remains for their children. It's a cultural element that remains for generations, and we have to fight against that. Because that woman that is poor and is household head with many difficulties has no access to financing, for example, as was mentioned here, or very limited access to technology. So there is a burden that keeps her in that situation with very important difficulties to have the step that will put her and her household in a different level. What we have seen is a very powerful road, which is women that are organizing local communities. The community leaders are a new way of organization that is working quite well. So supporting those community leaders make very visible the action of women as well. And it's a very important a way to advance. I also wanted to make a point regarding our effort to start from in the very low age, very early age of children. We must make or we must install the concept of equal rights from the beginning, from the first years of school, make it natural. Because if we do not do that, new generations will still carry the concept of differences, which is not rational sometimes, but it exists. So we need to open spaces for women from the base. We need to increase the speed of change. If we wait for women to access to the same rights at the speed, at the natural, let's call it like that, natural speed, it will take years. We need legislation to push the equality. And in our country, that is also a road. We have to increase the visibility of women, especially in climate change, has been very evident. We have had women in charge of the Ministry for the Environment, and the head of COP25 was also Minister Carolina Schmidt, a woman, and the field is quite strong in the participation of women. One last element that I want to mention is that there is a thin line between giving power or empowering women to be the community leaders to resolve some domestic issues like getting water or growing the food, and focusing on the domestic element. We have to empower women to make decisions and to increase their action and to be influential in their communities. However, we could resolve the domestic element of having access to water or food without giving the real power. So it's very important to be clear on the main objective, which is not just resolving the aspect that makes her active or more effective in their, for example, agricultural work. If it is still linked to a domestic activity, will still keep the image of women dedicated to that area and not to the decision making or pushing their communities ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gloria. And let's move from Latin America to Asia again and to Jayanti. I know, Jayanti, I mean, a very great passion for you has always been to fighting for migrant workers and informal workers. And we know that they suffer a lot in many countries, especially on the continent of Asia, with the recent kind of impacts of climate change and also, of course, COVID-19. So I wondered if you could inspire us and tell us a bit more, both on the regional and national level, what should be done to ensure the rights of these workers, and so they're very vulnerable in the climate vulnerable sectors and with different labor policies and so on. I know you have a lot to say about this.
Thank you, Brigitte. Actually, as far as the national, the steps for foreign migrant workers, the International Labour Organization has codified the most basic of these workers' rights, outlining 5 core labour standards that all labour markets should strive to meet. Freedom of association, right to collective bargaining, abolition of forced or compulsory labour, abolition of child labour and discrimination-free workplaces. However, with what Malaysia should do, or in the ASEAN context, capacity building, training of officials, from ASEAN member states, labor ministries, employer organizations, and trade union improves knowledge of effective labor sector practices and assist member states in incorporating this into their own country context, Brigitte. In terms of ASEAN promotion of the rights of migrant workers, the sending state should organize a pre-departure orientation education program, including human and labor rights, general working and living circumstances, law rules, regulations, culture, norms in close practices of the receiving state. Moreover, it should have the necessary measures to promote better local employment and livelihood opportunities for their citizens as sustainable alternatives to migration of workers. In Malaysia, we have policies, we have regulatory framework in ASEAN that can be regarded as having legal instruments, national labor and employment laws and institutions, bilateral, sub-regional and regional executive agreements, declarations, international instruments adopted through the multilateral system such as the ILO recommendation and other framework agreements, which provide guidelines with persuasive or recommendatory effects on individual states in order for them to apply the policies constantly. And these are reference materials that we have drawn a large reference to for our knowledge of what I've just spoken on migrant workers.
Thank you. So thank you so much, Ayanti. And to continue also with a more kind of geographic context, I would go to Susanna, and also to see, because you have your base currently in Europe, and you're also very active, Susanna, when it comes to the Labour International Climate Justice Committee. You are the deputy chair. If you could maybe, Susanna, if you could explain a bit more on the work that you're doing right now, and also if you could mention some priority areas of action to connect this, to accelerate the gender equality and climate resilience, how you can kind of combine them and to speed up the process. That would be fantastic.
Sure. Well, the Climate Justice Committee was created in 2018 to deliver liberal answer to the global climate crisis based on our core principle of individual freedom of choice, and rule of law. The committee has aimed to set a liberal agenda on climate justice. And during these last 2 years, we have been working on two flagship initiatives. First, the launch of the Climate Displacement Initiative that calls for the creation of an effective international framework to support climate-induced migrants and suggests a climate justice pathway that links human rights to social and economic human development by safeguarding the rights of the displaced people, and also proposes concrete policy recommendations for improvement. And the second flagship initiative is a study which is on its final stages on the missing links between the environment and the human rights. Following the great job initiated by President of the Parliamentary Assembly at the Council of Europe, Mr. Rick Dimes, Liberal International embarked on a journey together with representatives from the Liberal International Human Rights Committee and also the political group at the PATHE in developing a piece of work that highlights the essential obligations and responsibilities of countries and other duty bearers, including business, and their implications for climate agreements, policies, and actions. Climate change impacts directly and indirectly an array of guaranteed rights that are included in the Human Rights Convention. And those who have contributed the least to the consequences of climate change unjustly and disproportionately suffer its harms. As right holders, they must be meaningful participants in holding duty bearers accountable through national and international courts, as well as be primary beneficiaries of climate action. Climate justice requires that climate action is consistent with existing human rights. And this piece of work that I'm talking about attempts to articulate a common liberal voice on the intersection between human rights and the environment, looking at the science and evidence-based reasoning on why our individual rights are linked to the planet's ecosystems. So it also aims at eliciting a paradigm shift, elevating environmental concerns from the policy issue level to the status of an established fundamental right, and positioning right holders in order to ensure they are fully exercised this fundamental right. So this piece of work draws a roadmap on where Liberal International could bring this fight, taking a stand for the right to a safe, healthy, and sustainable environment, and strengthening governance and the environmental rule of law at all levels. So this is about the work of the climate justice. On the priority areas of action, and this is my colleagues have already stated many, but I would, in a sum, would consider like alleviating vulnerabilities and reducing inequalities, positioning women as fundamental game changers, also integrating gender considerations in climate actions at all levels, whether those are the NDCs, national adaptation plans, or risk management plans. It's also very important to integrate the gender considerations, and also pursuing women's leadership in climate-related conflict mitigation and prevention. So that would be my take for as priority areas of action. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Susanna, for this. And we know that it's a very ambitious climate justice committee that you're a part of, and you are really I mean, initiating quite a few different initiatives through the years. And we have received some questions from the audience, from people listening to this conversation. And I want to urge everyone that this part of the webinar to drop your questions in the chat. But I'm going to read one, and some of you have already answered among the panelists, but please feel free to answer. And the question is that is, among the participating organizations, what kind of current programs do they have designed to tackle gender and climate issues? And some of you have already mentioned this a bit, but if more voices want to be heard, I'm just opening up the conversation. So what kind of initiatives, current programs do you have that are designed to tackle gender and climate issues? Who would like to start off by answering? Please unmute yourself. Do we have someone that volunteers that would like to elaborate a bit? Please go.
All right,
Yeah.
so
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, of course. You are on the land. We are in the office, so it's different. More important to listen to you.
All right, well, thank you so much. So for MOVE, the program that we have in the rural area, we had been working with women's empowerment on national level, talking about policy, women's economic empowerment, access to justice, access to land. But one thing that I noticed is that we have good traction. We see an increase in women's leadership in policy levels, but you don't see much on grassroots level. So as we are talking about human rights and the rule of law and having choice and vibrant democracies, what we saw was that there is no vibrant democracy without active citizenship. So in most of our communities, you will see that most women living in rural areas don't even know what that means, don't even have time to consider what their rights are, because they are busy fighting for the simple basic rights. Like you mentioned, Hakima, they have to walk long distances to get water, fetch firewood. They are really busy with that. So it's very difficult for them to have the privilege that we have to really think about your human rights and how you fight for your human rights. So what we have done this year is, instead of giving money to women in terms of economic empowerment, we want to see how development would happen in a small area if you focused on women in agriculture, which would mean that women have access to land, you would promote their land rights through their agricultural activities. So starting last year, we started engaging, mobilizing dairy farmers. And dairy farmers, because dairy farming is also not a very traditional business for women. Ownership of livestock, especially large livestock like cattle, is not for women, basically. So what we have done is gone back to the grassroots and looked at the governance structures that we have. So instead of just talking about leadership at the top, we are engaging women, dairy farmers, through helping them address the issues that they have in their sector within the village. So then when you're talking about these issues, whether it's a market access, whether it's access to land, whether it's extension services for their animals, you're also talking about their rights, their economic rights. And through that, then we are engaging the local structures like the village development committees, the area development committees. So we are making an argument that unless if women participate in those structures, we will not see any type of movement. So it's the same notion that we have, that when we are engaging women on that level, we also will have access to women's local knowledge of land management, women's local knowledge, like I think it was Susanna who mentioned that individual rights are linked to natural ecosystems. And that is what we are looking at. So now we have a pilot. Women in dairy are our first target, but we are looking at how do we look at development? How do we engage local rural women to really talk about rights? Not from this perspective, like I was saying, that, you know, when you ask a woman in my village, for example, what does development mean to you? Is quite different. The answer is, I mean, actually, it's difficult to have that conversation. So when we talk about research, for example, I would really love for us to engage in participatory research, to work with the women, to understand their ideas, to understand how they live, to understand their aspirations and the challenges in terms of culture. So culture is dynamic, but it's also in other ways very static because it's linked to cultural practices, religion. So for us, what we are doing now is engaging women within their economic activity. Because what we had experienced before is that when you engage them, let's say women's economic empowerment or even women's rights trainings, you will find that the concept of human rights is very abstract to them because they can't apply it directly. But when you engage them in projects that are already there in their villages, then the concept of human rights becomes, I don't know, it's much easier to communicate it within the context of the work that they are doing. So that's what we are promoting right now, working on grassroots, using governance structures on grassroots to bring development to local areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And I know for sure from listening to the chat that quite a few people are supporting you in this. So I hope that they can reach out to you also to get more inspiration and what they can be doing to support your very important work. And I just want to try open up for the other participants if you also would like to describe a bit more current programs that you have connecting gender and climate issues. So who would like to go next? Gloria, please go ahead.
Thank you. In a more general view, we have special scores in many of the programs of the government that bring a preference to women. For example, when you allocate fiscal funds in support of low-income families, you have a higher score if you are a woman in charge of the household. There are also important networks, for example, for digital development based on training women to provide them the abilities to lead other developments in their communities. So working from the base, as was mentioned before, is very effective. Women tend to be very active, very well recognized by their communities. So when you put the power on them, then the power spreads very quickly and easily and in a very effective way, very concrete way. So that is the second. And then the social support, as I said, and also in different bids. For example, when we made a bid for the new transport system, if you have women as drivers, you have a higher score. So it's an incentive that brings more women in areas where the climate change has been focusing, like renewing all the transport fleet. So it's a direct and indirect work, and is advancing, but we are still far from our objective. And I think the most effective is the quota that is stated by law elections. You have, it's mandatory that your candidates must be 40% women. So that forces the search for leaders, for local leaders, and the visibility of women also in the political activity. It's a mix of actions and mix of programs that are working together.
Thank you so much, Gloria. Do other people from the panel would like to answer the same question about initiatives connecting gender and climate issues? Please go ahead. Susanna?
If I may, besides whatever it's been stated, I believe it's key to any initiative to have put in forward has to have an holistic approach. Also, keep working on a better understanding on the connections between climate, gender, and conflict. And something that is quite successful, and it's to gather strong evidence base of the successful participation of women in addressing climate security and peace issues. No, for example, there's the UN Joint Program on Women, Natural Resources, and Peace, established by the UNEP, the UN Women, UNDP, and the UN Peace Support Office in 2016, has demonstrated that natural resource-based intervention are a powerful tool for strengthening women's participation in conflict prevention and resolution efforts, also in democratic governance and economic recovery and sustainable development. No? So this, and also keep working on addressing the barriers to women's meaningful participation and local leadership. This, I believe, really accelerates gains across gender equality, peace, security, sustainability, and also climate resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. Jayanti, do you want to add something to the conversation?
Yeah, Brigitte, before I leave, I would like first to thank all our speakers, wonderful speeches and very inspiring one. And I would like just to share my experience with you. You know, I was working on the ground during 25 years. Then I was on the table of negotiation during the UNFCCC Convention for the Climate Change. And I was vice president of the Paris Agreement, so I was fully involved in the negotiation of the Paris Agreement together with Christiana Figueres and Laurence Tubiana. And I was also very active with women leaders and the former president of Ireland, and who was working on climate justice. But let me tell you something, and I'm feeling Fatso today very deeply, because the difference between what we think and what we advocate for when we are in these multilateral events and meetings is completely different from the needs, the basic needs of those women on the ground, and the pain they have to survive to climate change and to be resilient and to adapt themselves to climate change. I saw many, and I can tell you that many conflicts in Africa are there because of resources, of natural resources, either land or water or wood. So I think, and this is what I have, what I asked, why I asked Jason to share this project together with you. And I work together with women who are heading cooperatives in Senegal, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Angola, in South Africa, to develop this kind of project. We should be more concrete because yes, we can advocate for women's rights. We can advocate for education of girls because many girls in Africa are not going to school because they are going to fish for water. But now what we can do to be more concrete is to build something to support women to live in dignity and to allow them to send their girls to school and to develop their families. So thank you. I'm so sorry I have to leave. It was wonderful to talk to all of you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Hakima. And Jayanti, I think you were supposed to drop in and to say something before that.
Brigitte, I wanted to say something, but I'm overwhelmed with all the speakers who have already, I think, said everything with so much of passion. I think I'd rather wait for whether there's anybody else who wants to add any more before.
Yeah. We actually have some questions from the audience here, so I'm going to read one from Stena, and the question is like this: how do we deal with diversity? We are affected differently from continent to continent, but the effect involves us all in one way or the other. But how do we deal with diversity for this common problem, climate change? Would you like to start, Jayanti?
I think from the Asian context, from Malaysia, there is diversity because in Malaysia we have different races, we have different religions, we are diverse in our own different ways. However, as far as climate policies and climate change and the conflicts are concerned, as I said earlier in my presentation, we are very far behind. We are now pushing forward to ensure that the government recognizes that there needs to be a change. There needs to be partners who come forward in women to ensure that they can actually make that change and ensure that these are issues that mean a lot to women. And I think we need the women at that decision-making process, and that we are very, very underrepresented. So we are doing everything that we can. We have to learn from our sisters from across the world, from Europe, from Africa, from Latin America, and from everywhere else. And I think we have to draw energy and to ensure that we also move forward. And hopefully by the next conference, we have progressed more and we have done more for our women in Malaysia. So I think that's crucial. I think our voices are being silenced. We're not heard as much as we should be heard. And I think there's much, much more that needs to be done, Brigitte, as far as Asia, Malaysia is concerned.
Thank you, Jayanti. And also to build on Stena's question about diversity, we have a new question that is a bit connected to that I wanted the panel to reflect upon from Kupakwashe Matangira. How do we engage young people in climate change policy in a meaningful way? I mean, that's also connected to of course, to diversity, to have the full population part of this. So who would like to go next and answer that? Please just raise your hand or unmute yourself. Gloria?
Thank you. Yes, how to involve young people is much easier than older people. Young people is much more aware of the need to take action in favor of mitigating climate change. And we have installed many new regulations in the country, such as not using plastic bags, for example, or the straw to drink soda are also renewable. So in many things that are in their common lives, the concept of taking care of the environment is very present. And you can see in many schools, the brigades, climate brigades, or action-specific programs that install the responsibility towards our environment. So I think the younger people are a very strong base to multiply the message and to make it visible, and also to push older generations to be more aware and more active and careful regarding our environment.
Do we have more voices around this question?
Sure, I can go ahead. Okay, so what I'm saying is, I think the disconnect comes from the fact that we are not connected to the land. I think most of us get water from our tap, so rain might not be an issue for you. I think the connection between our lives and land is very important to understand. And for me, I think it's important for every single person, whether that person is a young person, whether it's an American or a Malawian, African or European, everybody must understand that for us to be here today, we've had to eat from the soil. Therefore, it is extremely important for us to have healthy soil. It's also very important for us to have clean air. It's also important for us to have water. Water is not an African resource problem. Water is a global problem. So therefore, it is essentially important for every citizen of the globe to make sure that we have a good, sustainable environment. And that is our responsibility every day. So in order for us to engage young people to come on board, we must give them the responsibility. In my own culture, we tend to undermine the young people's responsibility to come on the table. I think they must understand as citizens that they have the right because they enjoy the benefits of being here as human beings on Earth. Therefore, they must ensure that the land is healthy, the air is healthy, there is enough water for everybody. So for me, I think that it's essential for us first to understand as human beings, and in terms of diversity, that's the same. It's like what I said about the sun. It's the same sun that rises and sets in the Northern Hemisphere that does in the Southern Hemisphere. It is the same land that we're using. It is the same water that we're using. We are all interconnected and interdependent. And in terms of our diversity, we might not understand each other's cultures, but I think we must make an effort to understand that we live in a diverse world. We understand that we have different types of religion, beliefs, and whatever. But essentially, we are human beings, and we must be sustained by this very same earth that we all live in. Thank you.
And Susanna, thank you so much, and Patso. And Susanna also raised her hand on this one.
Yes,
go ahead.
Very briefly, and to add on the diversity question. Mitigation, adaptation, gender responsive action can serve as a drive and can play a strong role in transforming gender norms and furthering gender equality. It's a fact that unfortunately women are often marginalized in the development of climate policies, and consequently climate responses can reflect a gender bias. So often women are not consulted adequately, and thus policies do not reflect the needs of women, as someone has stated already. So once more, women have a valuable experience in natural resources management and in building resilience, and therefore their full, equal, and meaningful participation is key in the shaping of mitigation and adaptation strategies. Likewise, and as I said, integrating gender considerations into international, national, subnational, and local climate plans can contribute to reduce the risk and vulnerability of women and girls. So mitigation and adaptation strategies and policies must be gender responsive, but also have to be inclusive and attentive to the local conditions. So that's how we can bring on diversity.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Susanna. And as you all see, time is almost like running out now. We have like 3 minutes left for this webinar. And I would like to end the session by thanking Liberal International, NDI, and INLW for arranging this conversation. And I know this is not the last time that we'll be discussing all these things. And I can also see in the chat that quite a few of you have asked questions that we never had time to to discuss and reflect upon, but I urge you to reach out to the participants and also to continue this conversation. And I also would like to of course, thank our panelists, Gloria Hart, Ajanti Devabalagru, and Fatso Jumbe, and Susanna Rivera Bogman for sharing your experience and expertise. And talking about young people like we did here, reflecting on who got the young people into the movement, I wanted to end by quoting Greta Thunberg, who has been one of the young female leaders in this movement. And she said something wise, I think, a few years ago around connecting climate and the democracy. And she said, fighting for climate justice is also fighting for democracy. Our civilization will be increasingly threatened as the planet destabilizes, putting everything at risk, including democracy. And this is a major threat because democracy is everything, and we can't save the living planet without it. And I think that's also very important to connect that democratic parties worldwide, no matter the ideology, they need to do more cross-party work in this area, because otherwise we will never be able to defend democracy or to put an end when it comes to the environmental policies that we have in far too many countries right now, and to deal with the climate change. So thanks everyone for participating, especially all the people also listening into the conversation. And I hope that you can reach out to the panelists and to the Liberal International and to NDI and the Network of Liberal Women if you want to discuss this further. But thanks everyone for being part of the conversation, and I wish you a great day or evening wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much.